Okay, so now we're diving into your pre-submitted questions. So hopefully we've covered some of the questions you had about benchmarking. Again, a lot of this was influenced by the collective, so we know we're hearing from you about what's important within the benchmarking data that you want to see. But here were some other questions that some relate to benchmarking and some are just related to US and global policies generally. So we can dive right in.
Yeah. So Laura, let's start with the first one here. How often do you think we should global mobility or HR professionals should benchmark their policies against industry standards?
I think yearly. And before you say, "Oh my God, that's a lot of work," I think with policies, you probably already have some sort of protocol on a yearly basis to be revisiting policies generally, and just make sure that immigration is included in that. Make sure that you have an immigration policy, and that from year to year, there's going to be changes in the immigration space, especially the U.S. It's a dynamic space, so a policy that made sense for your program last year may not make sense here, especially in light of cost containment pressures we're seeing from our clients' leadership. Revisiting the policy is a way to address those cost containment issues. So again, year to year, there's going to be new challenges, issues that the company is going to be wrestling with, and looking at it yearly is your best bet.
Yeah. And I think, keeping an eye on things throughout the year and keeping notes for yourself is a great idea. I mean, we're going to be releasing new surveys and benchmarking data on a rolling basis throughout the year. I know when we're, meeting with clients, I'm meeting with my clients, quarterly to talk about what's going on. So it's not that, not to touch anything for a year, but to kind of take that time to, I think, gather the information to equip yourself to fight for what the policy changes you might want to have when it does come to the year mark. I think the pace of change, I'm going to jinx myself here. There are some countries that are different, but I think the pace of change outside the US is sometimes a little bit slower. So you might be able to get away with a little bit longer lead time there. But I agree, Laura, yearly is probably a good idea these days. Uh,
And kind of calendaring like that. It's not like you have to be looking at it on a weekly basis, but like by
yeah.
Q3, having a stakeholder meeting about feedback. And, by the end of Q3, you're incorporating benchmarking data as you're reviewing your policy, like setting up a schedule so
Mhm.
that you're not constantly having to go back to your policy, but, making sure that the end of year or whenever your, fiscal year is, so that when you're announcing the new policy or any changes, you're doing so like, consistently in the next year and rolling it out.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. Kind of build in those steps for yourself leading up to the year mark and have it be consistent year to year.
Yeah.
All right, so now we've got the frequency of benchmarking. What about identifying companies to benchmark with, Laura? Do you have thoughts around that?
So ideally, you're benchmarking within similarly sized programs, whether that's based on, US foreign national population or, similar global footwork. Like Audrey mentioned at the top of the hour, we hosted a like local benchmarking roundtable with similarly sized programs with a similar size and footprint of global. So that was really cool in that these programs had a lot of shared challenges, shared program identity, and that was also industry specific. So ideally, that's who you're benchmarking with, but that's not always available. And right now, what we're striving for is to build up the collective so we can segment the data with that kind of insights. Right now, we're still gaining traction and still growing. So I think, having the verified data, having transparent data is key for benchmarking so that you know that it is reliable data within global mobility. And so that's where we're starting, and where we're going is to be able to segment that data for more insightful benchmarking so that you can pull program size, global footprint, and industry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's really crucial on the global front as well, because, what might be possible from a policy or program perspective in one country might just not be possible in another. So I'm really excited about the collective and, growing the data to a size where we can slice and dice it so it's most helpful and can match up with where people have their global footprint. What is one core immigration policy to mend from your benchmarking, Laura?
This sounds really obvious, but having a policy.
No vibes? We can't go
No
on
bias.
vibes.
The case by case review or case by case assessment of, whether that's global overseas relocation or initiating green card policy just is really dicey. And so we're seeing that come up in the benchmarking data, which suggests that there may not be a policy in place. And so, yeah, no vibes checks because you're opening up yourself to liability, like employment liability of if you're consistently or inconsistently offering benefits to employees. So having a policy, and that makes your life as the global mobility manager easier in that when a benefit can't be granted to a foreign national employee, it's not because you don't want it or because the vibes are off, it's because the policy said so and how it's defined. So that's the recommendation, is to have a policy and to revisit and review it yearly, whether that's with the benchmarking data or just making sure it's the right culture and program fit for your company, because your company may change initiatives or priorities over the year based on leadership or company initiatives. So having a policy and reviewing it yearly based on benchmarking and, company priorities is key here.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm going to repeat myself here, but another plug for the one thing that, other than having a policy, yes, it's very good. You can blame the policy if you can't do something. Always a very good strategy. But that menu of options, if you're going to consider, international assignments, rotational programs, having a menu of which are the countries that are an option, so that you're not fielding inquiries on, 112 different countries that your employees would like to go to as part of the rotational program will save you developing some gray hair, hopefully. Yeah,
Sounds
we've already
great.
talked, I think, about do you have benchmarking data by sector or country coming soon? Already answered a lot of the last one too. I don't know, we could pull out, what data or metrics track to measure how successfully your global mobility policy is being executed. You have any thoughts around that, Laura?
I think it really boils down to what your company cares about or what your company culture priorities are. I know a number of programs really care about like life cycle time, that they want to make sure things are getting processed quickly. And so that can be a very easy data metric you request your vendor to do, saying how long does it take from initiation to case filing? How quickly are we doing it to identify both, is your vendor acting within a processing timeframe you're expecting and are paying for, and then also like within your internal team, are you responding to the data requests within the timeframe you're expecting your in-house folks to manage? So I think life cycle timeframe could be a way to measure success. I don't know that that necessarily goes for policy, but it would be like program initiatives or like KPIs. So
Mhm.
just throwing sort of a different take on that question, answer to that question out there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's kind of where I went with it too, Laura, thinking about when I'm meeting with clients quarterly and looking at, data from Rapid, which is our case management system that can actually, track internal processing time, how long is it taking for the client to provide information? How long is it taking for us to prepare things? How long is it taking for the government to adjudicate? I think that is definitely seen in many companies as a measure of success of the global mobility program, I guess, more than the policy. I think in terms of the policy, it would be, do you have or does your policy address the things that are common challenges for you? When you have employees coming to you and pressuring you for something, can you point to the policy and say, oh, we can do this, but not that? I think if you're, fielding a lot of queries that you don't have addressed in your policy, then that might be something to consider for your next year's cycle and amending it. Let's see here. Lots of questions, so many questions. What are some examples of how data and insights are used to help organizations make informed decisions?
So this one, I think you could take a lot of different ways. Again, you could be pulling, data and insights from your own program about cycle time, about, requests for evidence or audit rates, and understanding from the data, like, are we providing the right information to our vendors to prepare quality applications to not be audited. Like that could be a way you could be pulling data from your program. You could be pulling program data for, again, how quickly it takes to file your application. So there's a ton of ways to think about data and so far as your program. I think another way you can use the data is like benchmarking here about is my program in line with what the market overall is moving towards in global mobility? And does that make sense for our company? Are we wanting to align with the market, or are we wanting to differentiate ourselves? Like we want to be giving really attractive immigration benefits to recruit foreign national talent. So I think you could, it depends on what question you're trying to answer, or what problem you're trying to solve and how to use the data. I think you want to make sure you're asking those types of questions to your U.S. Immigration Counsel, your global mobility vendor, so that they can point you in the direction of here's the data we maintain for your program. Here are some insights that make sense. Like if I've had programs that really care about employee satisfaction, and so there's a number of ways to measure that with survey response directly to the foreign nationals. And I have some companies that take that internally because they want, the feedback both on their internal program, their in-house folks, and their immigration vendors. So I don't know. I mean, you could take this a lot of different ways, but that it's all about what question or problem you're trying to solve. And then making sure your vendor has some sort of data and data integrity in place to help support you answer those questions based on your program.
And I think it is a lot about the problem you're trying to solve. How can you use data to try to address that problem? I think I'm going to take us into the cost element here too, because I often see companies using data insights that, we're able to provide to help them make informed decisions. When we're seeing more companies in certain sectors, not all sectors, but in certain sectors really becoming a lot more cost conscious and, trying to reduce their budgets and do more with less, which is always what you want to hear when that's applied to your department. Get everyone everywhere in the world they need to be in a compliant manner for less money. But I think you can, particularly on the global side, look at again, that menu of options and what do the different jurisdictions cost, and maybe you cross, and we have had global mobility professionals we work with cross off options from that list of countries that they would otherwise consider because of the cost factor. Okay, how much is it costing us foreign workers in the UK? Well, that's too much. Maybe we need to pivot and look at other locations where we have offices where the government fees are measured in hundreds of dollars, not thousands. So that's one example of where I've seen data be useful, the financial reporting and the forecasting. And I think that segues into, are there any budget control or cost-effective strategies in immigration that are around the U.S. side?
I think it's a review of policy and the benefits companies have been historically granting to foreign national employees. I think it's also looking to see if there are efficiencies within, technology to to save on costs. So that's sort of a broad answer of like companies are looking at their own programs to see whether they can pursue batch program, meaning they can leverage the same prevailing wage determination and recruitment efforts to cost contain on those expensive pieces of a green card sponsorship case or cases. So folks are looking to be creative using data and technology more and more for the goal of cost containment. I think there's also just an awareness then the education within the global mobility space for like leaders like CFOs that might be pushing down these budget constraints of understanding. I had this question come up with a client where they're like, well, we want to spend less. And it's like, well, actually, our fees are here and the costs that are going up are the USCIS, the filing fees, and sort of explaining that and giving a chart of that breakdown that they were thinking, oh, we'll bring everything in-house. to save, and that really what they were noticing were the USCIS fees go up, and so it was sort of an education of where the breakdown, where the fee breakdown is, to the CFO
Mhm.
about where the costs were coming from and why it was increasing.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think education is so important when it comes to cost because it's really easy to have misunderstandings about where the increased costs are coming from. I think understanding and, you know, the different services that are available. Some things are a must if you're going to employ someone in a particular country, but other things, some companies are moving to handling just the core process for the employee and not the dependents, for example, or not necessarily including consular assistance or having different levels of service. Again, this is based on seniority or the role of the employee, where sometimes we're seeing, okay, well, your executive level employees are getting still really all-inclusive service, and then the more entry level folks are getting a different service model. I think with that, it's really important, as Laura was mentioning, to educate folks so there's not a mismatch between expectations and service delivery, because then you're going to have people that are frustrated. And then to provide, standard supporting documentation and materials to help guide people. If you're not going to provide an all-inclusive experience for them, well, what resources can you provide them to help them, do it themselves, to make it clear for some of those add-on services that are not necessarily a must, that the company must cover. But it's tricky when you're in that position, for sure, having the cost pressure, and then you've got the pressure from the employees, wanting everything, wanting, multiple green card sponsorship paths and everything else.
The other thing
Um,
that I just thought of from a cost containment strategy is some programs are really keen to do pre-hire assessments. And in a
mm,
pre-hire assessment, the immigration global mobility vendor can project out, okay, here's what the initial costs are, and future cost for the green card sponsorship based on your policy is going to look like. All in, here's the bill, so to speak, so that when the manager's considering the applicant or their top choice, here's also what this comes with. And I would say that
mm,
when we are doing this, it is not like the manager still is pursuing foreign national talent at the same rates. Like, we're not seeing
mm,
managers change based on what the cost for sponsorship will look like, even with increased costs. They're really doing the measure of who's going to be the best candidate for the role that I have open, that I need immediately filled with the top talent to do the role, to perform the role. But that to sort of make sure everybody's aware of what that takes, whether that's the manager's involvement, completing questionnaires, being involved in the process, and also from a budgetary standpoint, that's been made clear, especially for global mobility that is facilitating these conversations. We don't want the manager to come back to the global mobility being like, you never told me this is what it would take. So it's
mm.
nice to have an assessment process in place for a cost conversation. It may not end up controlling the cost where the manager chooses a different candidate, but at least there's this awareness and education as part of the process, the hiring process.
Absolutely. No, and I think like looking at that projection, which I love that we can do the financial projections in our system, looking at the projection over time, like
Yeah.
until this person gets to the point of permanent residence, is so important, because that can also change the strategy that the company is pursuing. Like, I have a top technology company that I represent, and they were, debating the other day about, like, okay, how long should we ask for in terms of the duration of their UK visas? Because it is so expensive, and some of the costs are based on the number of years you're requesting, and you can request up to 5 years, and then at 5 years they can qualify for permanent residence. And the initial thought was, oh, we should just request a couple of years and not the 5. But then going back and looking at it, it's like, okay, if you request 5 right away, then you're not incurring those attorney's fees to extend the permit once or even twice in year 2 or 3 or 4. Yes, the government fees up front might be really high, but you're getting them all the way to the permanent residence mark. And then after 5 years, they can just pivot and get permanent residence. So actually, if the goal is to employ these people on a long-term basis, it's cheaper in the long run to get the more expensive 5-year visa than to get a 1 or a 2-year visa and then have all the attorney's fees to be extending that. So really important to look at the long run if you're hoping to retain talent long term.
Yeah, good point. And then all boils down to like, what is the company's talent goals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it are there long-term goals to retain, and talking that through with leadership to understand like there may be costs associated with our retention goals, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And also, if you are choosing to pursue policies that are a little bit outside the norm and giving more and spending that money, potentially, making that really clear in your recruitment. If you're fighting with your competitors for top talent and you start the permanent residence process on day one, well, that's a perk. Take credit for it too, I would think. Like if you're going to make the decision to spend those funds in a particular way, getting the most return on your investment, which is the next question here, which I think we have kind of already touched on. And I'm mindful we are running out of time. Andy, thank you for that reminder. I don't know, Laura, if there are particular questions that you want to pick out, because I don't think we're going to have time to answer every single one of them.
Let's just sort of see what we get through, and then folks can join us on the backstage after this if we don't get to your question. A lot of these questions were so good that we want to
Yeah.
try to get to them all. We're doing our best, but let's just see what we can tackle in the time remaining. Does that sound okay?
Sounds like a plan. I'll take the next question because it
Yeah.
is starts with global for once. So how can we build international alliances to strengthen immigration from the U.S. to other countries as well? Noticing that a lot of discussions are on immigration to the U.S. Very true. I mean, I think GMJ is global, so you're in the right place. WR is global, providing coverage to over 100 countries around the world. I would say, looking for those providers who are able to provide true global support can really help you to strengthen and to build your global program. And then, looking at the benchmarking as we roll out, join the collective, another plug for it. But as we roll out the global benchmarking and hopefully are able to segment that by global footprint, that can help you to make connections with other companies that share a similar footprint and to get insight from your competitors or others in the market who are experiencing the same challenges as you are, because it can be quite challenging when, U.S. immigration is not easy, but when you go from one country to covering dozens of countries, it can definitely drastically increase the complexity of the global mobility or HR role. So definitely draw on the resources that are available.
Yeah, and that, I think as a global mobility manager, I've talked about this on my podcast with Audrey before, that because of the low H-1B selection rates, which is quite frankly the most common pipeline for work authorization in the US for foreign national students, with those low selection rates, we're seeing more and more global trends or US outbound trends. And that as a global mobility manager, even if you're based in the US, sharpening your global assessment or your global understanding of mobility is key to, I think, your future career, because we're just, the US is so strict with these limits, at least at this point, with the foreseeable future, that the tide is turning more global, and that I've had to myself learn a lot more about global, and working with Audrey, I'm so grateful for that, because that's really where we're seeing the trends move and will
Mm-hmm.
continue to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that segues us into all the questions about the election. Close on a political note here. What changes do you see, Laura?
What's my biggest worry or concern regarding U.S. employment immigration should the Trump administration be elected? Well, I mean, we've seen the Trump administration. That was the previous administration. And the biggest concern is just the gutting of USCIS, or the internal mechanism of how U.S. immigration benefits are granted. Effectively, while Trump closed the border during COVID and with the Muslim travel ban in the start of his administration, he also effectively closed or significantly reduced employment immigration during his term by this delayed administrative burden. And if you read Project 2025, DHS will be completely dismantled and reassembled. But what we expect when I hear lean interpretation of what is currently USCIS is already operating really lean. And so what I am concerned about is just increased delays, and things are already moving that folks are just going to get stuck, whether that's going to be abroad or stuck in the US without work authorization because of delayed adjudication within the US Immigration Service. That is my biggest worry. And I think, as far as immigration policy changes, we would definitely see any benefits and flexibility that was rolled out during the Biden administration immediately closed down and unavailable. So where we were seeing a lot of flexibility in the '01 and the golden age of the national interest waiver, that's all going to go away, which again, effectively is going to just slow the ability for very qualified, highly qualified foreign nationals to maintain their status in the US for work authorization for companies that want them, and their ability to secure permanent residence through any kind of employment sponsorship. Yikes, that's ending on a pretty tough note there.
It's okay. We can find other places in the world for them to go, Laura. Don't worry.
Fair enough. Yeah, join us backstage because there are a ton of other questions we didn't have time to get to, and I'm sure maybe we've sparked some more interesting thoughts or insights and questions. So join us backstage.